for our Grand Lodge of New York. He's the chairman of the Custodians of the Work of the Grand Lodge of New York, Right Worshipful Samuel Lloyd Kinsey. Welcome back to the Craftsmen Online podcast.
Always happy to be here.
I'm glad we're getting to this one after a meal because we're going to be talking about food and especially the Festive Board and Freemasonry. I want to get kind of your take on this because we know you as a ritual guy, and that kind of sometimes takes you away from being in that social let's sit down and eat crowd, as we kind of joke about the fork and plate Masons. What makes a Festive Board different to you than a typical feast or lodge dinner?
Well, I think that it's nice to have traditions, and it's nice to we're very big in masonry on ceremonializing things and having to give toasts and those sorts of things, and I just think that makes it more interesting, right? I mean, so the Army and the Navy and the Marines, they have, for example, their own traditions of sort of this formalized dining sort of ceremonies and rituals, if you will. And I think it's just something that makes the dinner sort of more special, more fun, more interesting. It can be something that's done, once a year as sort of a big event, or it can be something that's really kind of done on a pretty regular basis. I mean, the sky is sort of the limit as far as like how that context can be used.
I like how you explain that because you're a member of Mariners Lodge number 67 in New York. They have one of the most famous festive boards. We're going to be we'll talk about the beefsteak dinner that's coming up and how people can get tickets and be a part of this year's event as part of our New York Masonic Con weekend, January in 2025. But first, I wanted to get to like the impression that you kind of put there, because I was thinking about all the formal dinners like galas or banquets before I joined Freemasonry that I would have sat down and attended. These are, your typical black tie affair. The first time I went to a Festive Board, it was completely different than anything I'd ever been a part of before, just like a lot of what we do in Freemasonry. What was your initial experience when you first attended a Festive Board at Mariners?
Well, so I really have to back up because the first festive board that I ever attended wasn't at Mariners Lodge. It was at Independent Royal Arch Lodge number 2. And you can't really talk about festive boards / table lodges, and we'll get into that in a minute, I'm sure, in the United States without talking about Independent Royal Arch Lodge number 2, and in particular, John Montpelier, who was a past master of that lodge. And so that was really a tradition that had largely kind of died out in the United States. People really weren't doing it. And so John, did a whole bunch of research and sort of wrote a paper and then started doing these, one in the fall and one in the spring, table lodges. And it's actually interesting. So it's a table lodge of instruction, right? So we'll sort of get into why that is. But that's really the sort of OG of American festive boards. And I would say really pretty close to 100% of festive boards in the United States are in some way derivative of or owe a great deal to the work that he did in creating that. And so at that time, they had a member of the lodge that worked at the Yale Club, and so they had these things in this cool room up in the Yale Club. And I just thought, I mean, look, it was just fun. It was interesting, right? There were these weird toasts that everybody was doing. People were getting up and giving responses, and there was sort of extemporaneous talking, and there was just this idea that hey, this is a special, cool thing that we're doing as Masons.
I want to get to the history of it because you talked a lot about ritual, and you're touching on the comeback, I guess, is the new generation, the modern Masons wanted to start bringing this back. For me, my mother lodge, St. George's number 6, they are known in the Albany area for their festive board, which is amazing. It's like a 7-course dinner practically with a cocktail hour. There's the reception time. The years that I've attended, they have done the meal planned around a menu that would have been something that George Washington would have ate. It's held at the
Very
Stockade in Schenectady. Yeah, it's a 200-year-old meal, and you basically are going to spend all day eating and drinking for what it would cost to take your lady out to a very nice restaurant, but it's just you as the Mason that gets to participate in this. But they would tell tale of Johnstown, St. Patrick's Lodge, which is another very close lodge to us in upstate, of back in the day when brothers would travel to go to lodges. It was by horse or by foot, and there'd be days to get there. They would have the meeting, then they would eat, and then usually sleep in the lodge. How much of the history of these table lodges or these festive boards can you separate from some of the myth and the lore that's started to become lately?
Well, so I think that there is some interesting history there. You can look at, there's sort of three, in my opinion, important books. They're unfortunately out of print, so they're not easy to find. That anybody who has kind of an interest in the history and development of Masonic ritual and ceremony should have. And there's one called Early Masonic Catechisms. There's another one with French exposures, and there's another one with later on English exposures. The Early Masonic Catechisms also has some manuscripts, and exposures were actually a very important vector of sort of sending out in ritual innovations and things like that in the Masonic community during the 18th century. And you can really look actually at the French exposures where you start seeing all of these things of what we would sort of consider to be a table lodge with specialized, toasting and these sorts of things. And so, we're talking 1740s or something like that. These things kind of started to evolve. And then I think if you start, when you come to the United States, I mean, one of the things that you can start to understand is that, let's say you have a lodge and you're meeting in a tavern or tavern-like accommodation. And most likely the proprietor was a Mason, and it would sort of, you'd have the making of the Mason part, would happen in a back room with the designs of the degree drawn in chalk and charcoal on the clay tiled floor. That presumably will resonate with Masons that may be listening. And then afterwards, you'd kind of come out and, hey, we might as well take advantage of the stuff that the proprietor has to offer. And everybody would kind of gather around a table, and the three great lights and the candles would sort of be set in front of the master, and the newly made brother would be seated at his right, and people would take refreshment, and they would sort of do the degree catechisms around the table, which would be a way of communicating the symbolic material of the degree to the new brother, which is, by the way, why we call our meetings communications. And so I can certainly imagine that you could have a colonial era lodge in the United States that was doing dining as sort of part of what they did as Masons, perhaps during a tiled portion of the meeting. Whether or not they were doing something that we would recognize today as being a table lodge or a festive board, I'm not sure. A lot of the things that you see as far as, that the red wine is gunpowder and the white wine is right. I mean, that traces right back to a French exposure that had that explanation in it. So, if that's something, and by the way, the English exposures that come later in the 1760s, to my recollection, have no mention of that kind of stuff. So you can imagine that it, it sort of took a while for these things to percolate over here. So, some lodges that are saying, hey man, we've been doing these festive boards, since 1770. Look, that's one of the beautiful things of Masonry is that if you say something is true for 5 years, let's say, it becomes true. And listen, I mean, that's exactly what we did with the Festive Board of Mariners Lodge.
I want to talk about that because this is the first time I've actually ever researched Festive Boards for this podcast episode. And I have purchased my ticket. I want to make sure that everyone's aware how to do this. You can go to our Grand Lodge website, or you can visit NewYorkMasonicCon.com, as the Mariners Festive Board this year is now part of the New York Masonic Con experience as we celebrate our first ever Masonic Con. It's going to be a Friday night. I believe it is January 5th. 17th. See, I knew you knew. And it's held in one of the most iconic places, the Grand Lodge of New York. And when I went to look at the history of it, I was a little nervous because this originally started on like barrels, and they would eat with their bare hands. Am I getting that part of the history correct?
Well, so the Festive Board, so to really kind of get into, what Mariners Lodge does, when I first became Worshipful Master of Mariners Lodge, and we were somewhat moribund at that time, and I wanted to, find some things that would give us a little forward momentum and pizzazz. And, one of the things about Masonic Hall here in New York City that's maybe not the greatest thing in the world is compared to, let's say, suburban and rural lodges, not that easy to do dining in the building. Right? I mean, it takes a lot of work. But I thought, so like most lodges, I would say, or, the meeting is over and they're kind of like, who wants to go out to the restaurant afterwards? And that ends up being 30% of the brothers, and everybody else kind of goes home. And like, that's sort of a bummer.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought, well, I'd like to do this dining in the building. And I thought also, like, hey, it would be cool if we were to do a Festive Board after every one of our first meetings of the month. And we do a very much reduced version of that for our regular things. And then I thought, well, let's try to create an extra special kind of Festive Board that we do. And so one of the things that I did, which I is basically created a bespoke Festive Board ritual for our lodge, referencing a lot of maritime symbolism. And, we light, red and green lanterns on the port and starboard sides, and all of these sorts of things. And that was absolutely, inspired by and largely following the framework of the Independent Royal Arch Lodge Festive Board. But one of the things that I did is I just tried to say, okay, so here's this unit that does this. This is what this does. And you can think about like the opening of a lodge, going around in New York, and taking the password from everybody. Well, the purpose of that is to make sure that everybody who's there is allowed to be there. And there's a lot of different ways you can do that, right? You go to certain places and they'll just say, brethren, satisfy yourselves that all present are entitled to remain. Other places, do other things. And so I tried to come up with like different ways of doing these things. And then I also took a lot of inspiration. At that time, there was this restaurant in New York City called Beacon that had this a beefsteak every year. And a beefsteak is an old New York City, 19th century, basically political event, going back to the Tammany Hall type days, where everybody would be wearing a butcher's apron, and you'd come in and there would just be platter after platter of, sort of roasted meat and schooners of beer. And they would say, Michael, it's your turn to go out and vote. And here's who you're voting for. And like, you'd go out and vote for that guy, right? And then you'd come back, you'd maybe have some more steak or they'd something, and they'd be like, it's your turn again. Now you're going to go out still voting for these guys early and often, right? And so it was a little bit of a stuffing the ballot box sort of a deal there. And so the way Beacon did it was multiple courses of different types of roasted meats. And I thought, hey, this is cool. We should do this. Now, again, no real kitchen facilities at Masonic Hall. And I have done some food writing and was always sort of involved in the sort of culinary stuff. And at that time was really the very early years of people learning how to use sous vide technology. And I thought, okay, if we're going to have 50 people here for dinner, you know, obviously we're not going to be pan frying these steaks over, like a Coleman stove or something. So we just did everything sous vide.
Wow. Okay. I
and
did not
and
know
that
that.
and so that's really how the maritime are. So it's the technically the full term of it is the Mariners Lodge Maritime Festive Board and Beefsteak Banquet, right?
Hmm.
So it's sort of talking about the ceremonies, and it's also talking about the food. And
That is a cool connection because it's a water. I love that. That's the common element there.
so the other thing that we did, and I don't know how every lodge does some of these things differently, but the table lodges that Independent Royal Arch Lodge does, the way that they typically work is you eat dinner completely, soup to nuts. You get your dessert and your coffee, and then they do the table lodge.
Mm.
And I thought, I would like to do this as part of the whole dining experience. And so it was like, okay, do the opening ceremonies, bring out a couple of different kinds of meats, right? Give everybody 20 minutes, right? Do a couple of toasts, bring out a bunch of other different sorts of stuff. And so to kind of really have the dining part intricately linked together with the ceremonies. And that's why, look, I mean, it takes 3.5 hours or something like that, right? I mean,
Mm.
I'm always trying to at the beefsteaks. One of the things that I'm always trying to say is, guys, pace yourselves. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. Like I'm sure these meatballs are delicious, but like don't eat 5 of them, because when it comes, at the end of the night, they're going to be bringing out lamb chops, and like if you're too full to have those, then
Pace
you
yourself.
maybe haven't. Yeah,
Taking
absolutely.
notes here for this dinner. Well,
And
because
so, yeah.
your event has two things that I would say are iconic. One is the photo that seems to be taken every year and perhaps you could expand a little bit more on the story and how you have to get permission to actually have the dinner in the Grand Lodge room. But there's always that shot from the balcony where you see literally hundreds of brothers wearing their aprons, like looking up and waving and hoisting. But then there's, Auld Lang Syne gets sung. They get to wear the aprons. This year there's a commemorative glass that I went in for on my ticket, because I've only heard tale of brothers, at least from upstate New York, that would travel down to New York to be a part of this event. And I was so excited to get to attend this year. So can you expand a little bit more, maybe take us behind the scenes on how you make this such a dynamic event?
Well, I mean, so look, part of it is you just have to start growing things, right? The first one of these that we did, I don't know, maybe 40 people came to it. And then they just sort of got bigger and bigger, and they actually then created. So it used to be that we'd have our dinners, and we did these festive boards up on the 19th floor of Masonic Hall, which doesn't exist anymore. I mean, the floor exists, but it's been completely given over to something else. And there was a couple of electric stoves. There was no hot water. There was no dishwasher. Uh, and so, but then they opened these. They have a really nice banquet rooms now that they have on the 8th floor, and I think the 12th floor, maybe the 10th floor. I can't remember. One of those other floors. And so we were able to start, doing our monthly, our regular sort of short form festive boards there, and we were invited to pair up with another lodge, which I think was Harry S. Truman Lodge, and to do basically the inaugural festive board of the Jacobean Room, which is on the 8th floor of Masonic Hall. And so that, was about 110 people, right? And so, that started to be, people were sort of like, this is pretty cool.
Mm.
And, then, word spreads, right? I mean, you'd like to have these things sell out. We definitely, max capacity on that room is really probably circa 100 people. So, it's always nice. You always know you're doing something right if you get people 5 days before begging you for tickets and there's just no way. And so then when it was during the term of Grandmaster Williamson was the first time that they had this International Grand Lecturers Convention. A lot of people don't know, but there's around 50 jurisdictions around the world that practice the standard work of the Grand Lodge of New York. And so we invited them all here to sort of, talk about how to do it, right? And so I remember that I looked at the date of that thing and I was like, well, that's kind of a bummer. This is cross-scheduled with when we had the beefsteak was going to be. I guess we'll have to schedule that on another date. And so I'm talking to the Grand Master. I was one of his district deputies. And he was like, no. We scheduled on that day on purpose. And I was like, what? And he says, yeah, man, we want to do this thing in the Grand Lodge room. And so I thought, all right, let's do this. And so, we had quite a few people from the, obviously we probably had, 150 of the people there were delegates to the Grand Lecturers Convention. So there was, I don't know, 10 Grand Masters of various different Grand Lodges around the world there. And then there was another, total attendance was, in the high 300s. And that's just cool. I mean, you look at these things and you see a bunch of guys in tuxedos, wearing butcher's aprons, holding up big glasses of beer, and everyone is, singing the our lodge sea shanty together, and it's just a cool event, And so 2 years later, we were invited to do it again in the big room, and we're hoping to do that again this year. I mean, it's not cheap for the trustees of the Grand Lodge, to enable us to do that in there, and so we're grateful for it's basically, it's a money loser for them, that there's no, and certainly for us, I mean, I'm by no means implying that what we charge for this thing is cheap, because it isn't, but the value that you get is really, you'd be paying at least double that, we're trying to keep it affordable for the brethren, basically through hours and hours of backbreaking volunteer labor.
Yeah.
And so, we try to give over as much money as we can to the trustees. We're not really making a big profit on this, and so I think that, and they're probably taking a bit of a hit. But it's it's something that's good for the craft, and we try to use that event also as a way of promoting what they do. And making sure that their message gets out there and the good works that they do, the Masonic Care Community and the Masonic Medical Research Institute and those sorts of things. And so it just kind of scales up and down. We did one last year just in the Jacobean room with about 110 people. And there's definitely lessons that you learn along the way, right? In terms of, what do we need to have? Because the food is all prepped on a different floor from where the event happens. And so, we have to rent these catering cabinets, that are going to keep things warm so that they can sort of load those up and then take them in an elevator down to the other floor and then have people, running out to get the platters on the tables while they're still hot. It's quite a production. It's not easy.
I can only imagine. I mean, I've planned 2 table or festive boards for my lodge here in DC, and I literally do that kicking and screaming because I know the amount of work that goes into it, and the reward is always great that evening. But it is like planning a private party at your house. You really, as the host, sometimes you don't really get to enjoy everything. You're hoping that the company does. Right. But in this instance, Friday, January 17th, the food starts at 6:30 with the event. It's the Mariners Festive Board and beefsteak dinner. You can get tickets at 2 places. You can go to the Mariners Lodge website, or you can get them through the NewYorkMasonicCon.com website. Either way, we hope to see you there Friday, January 17th at the Grand Lodge building. Brother Sam, I want to talk to you about something we got into a little bit earlier, and I don't know how much of a sticking point this is, but I'm one of those guys that I'm constantly correcting people. Is there a difference between a table lodge and a festive board, or should I just drop it?
I mean, so I would say yes and no. I mean, most people would tell you that a table lodge is tiled and a festive board is not. Um, that may be a fairly modern distinction. I
Mm,
think that certainly people would say, that the brethren gathered around the festive table or whatever, right? I know that, as I say, Independent Royal Arch Lodge calls their event a table lodge, but during the ceremonies of opening it, they say it's a table lodge of instruction, and so it's not tiled. Um, and so, that's and so that can actually be confusing to people, right? Who would say that a table lodge has to be tiled, because people refer to that event as the table lodge. Um, whether or not that's an important distinction to make, I couldn't say. I mean, I will say that I think that lodges should experiment with actually doing table lodges.
hmm
Um, it's a thing that we do with some fair amount of regularity in Mariners Lodge, where let's say we're doing a first degree, and the room that we normally meet in is right next door to the Jacobean room, which is a banquet hall in Masonic Hall that was converted out of a lodge room that just wasn't used very much. And so we'll do like the first section, through the obligation and all those sorts of things in the regular lodge room. And then we will retile in the Jacobean room with tables around the outside. And we have a piece of the floor is covered with this sort of chalkboard paper. And we're lucky to have some good artists in the lodge that, draw the mosaic pavement and the blazing star and all those kinds of things. And we retile in there. Everybody sort of grabs a plate and kind of sits around the outside looking in. You can't serve booze, at least in our jurisdiction. No alcohol while the lodge is open. Um, but so then we'll do, the lectures part, right? The catechism lectures, the historical lecture, the charges in tiled in the Jacobean room at table. And then after you close, sure, you can then, once the lodge is closed and you want to have some wine and do some toasting or whatever it is. And to me, that's really something that more and more a thing that lodges should experiment with, because listen, at some point you've been to 22 entered apprentice degrees, and I mean, I've been to infinitely more than that.
mm.
But the brethren like need some reasons to come out other than just loyalty, and having something like that just sort of makes it different and a little bit special uh, can be a great way to get people to come out. And lodges should really be thinking more creatively as far as that goes. I mean, my lodge also, we've done on a couple of occasions, we've conferred degrees in ships at sea and international waters.
That's
We
cool.
we've had permission to do that.
So back to the role of the table lodge or festive board in Freemasonry. I think it's interesting, and we also touched on this earlier as well. Like basically, it's making a comeback, and I credit a lot of it to like the boomer generation, especially here in DC. Most worshipful Joseph Crociata, past Grand Master of DC. He's also a member.
Member of Independent Royal Arch Lodge #2.
Thank you. He reminds me we have that discussion all of the time. He's really into doing these, but also doing them right. And I'm sure that there's brothers that are listening right now going, well, gosh, I wish my lodge could do a table lodge, or I wish we could do a festive board, but we barely have enough guys that are showing up as it is, or there's too much cost, or nobody wants to do the work. Or can you talk a little bit about the importance of this is I think a great opportunity to travel to a lodge where they do it right, and that's a
For
cool
sure.
part of a tradition.
Getting people is an important part of creating excitement in a lodge. One of the things that I did when I became Master of Mariners for the first time we have a relationship with a lodge, a Delphic Union Lodge number 14 in the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge here. And when you invite those guys to come, I mean, they show up.
Mm.
And so there was a meeting when I was senior warden where it was just like it was just like, oh man, there's like 45 people in the room for this meeting, and that was exciting. It didn't matter that, only 20 of them were our guys, right?
Right.
Because guess what? In the next meeting, more than 20 of our guys showed up, right? And so that certainly is, you'd like for people from all over to be able to come to an event. I mean, that to me was always in doing this Beefsteak Festive Board, it's not a fundraiser. It's not, it was really just meant to be, hey, let's do a kick-ass Masonic dinner that a bunch of people are going to come to and they're going to have a great time. And it's going to be some unique stuff about our lodge. And I also think that one of the best things that a lodge can do to revitalize, if maybe they don't have a lot of attendance or these sorts of things, is go to lodges that are doing it right and steal their ideas. And, it's, listen, you do that idea, you get this one lodge that does this cool thing, and you're like, oh, I like that idea. We're not going to do exactly what they do. And so it's going to be, I mean, listen, frankly, the whole point of doing this festive board in the first place is an idea that I got from Independent Royal Arch. And, a lot of people would sort of look at what we do and wouldn't even necessarily know that the two of the things are related, because I just sort of rewrote everything extensively.
Mm-hmm.
And
well, you saw it was possible from an event, but you would have never had the gem of that idea or the germ of that idea unless you went to Independent Royal Arch first. Yeah.
And and I think it's also, I would say actually ours is maybe more ceremonialized than theirs is. Like their table lodge has parts really basically just for the master and the wardens. And, we have the light, we have also parts for the deacons. We light these running lights. There's a lot of extra sort of stuff in there. That's I did a lot of research from Navy formal dining traditions and sort of went into some of the old legends of Masonry to try to find some stuff that I could repurpose. And that to me is actually an important thing, at least in our jurisdiction. And I think this is not true everywhere, but I think it is true most places. There's no prescribed ritual for doing a table lodge or a festive board.
That was my next question, because I've had to produce some of this before. My lodge here in DC, we did a joint event, and this is, something else I would preach to brothers or incoming masters, whoever may be listening, is that if you're thinking, I'd really like to do this, but I don't have the resources, whether it's, money, time, people to help with hands, even people to help attend, think about doing joint events with other lodges, and maybe 4 lodges get together and put together one great event instead of 4 lesser ones. But I basically had to take what exists for the Washington DC Grand Lodge jurisdiction festive board script, and then kind of marry or merge that with the Bethel that came to visit, the Job's Daughters Bethel that came to visit, and talk about interesting, all references, all alcohol out. We couldn't have any of that at an event with young ladies. They refer to each other as sisters, so we had to find a way to make that work as well. But we were literally writing the ritual, not on the spot that day, but like a month or so beforehand, and going between the two
100%.
to make sure. And it was a really unique experience.
And that is a thing that I encourage really all lodges to do, is to, and I've helped a lot of lodges with this, to sort of make, bespoke festive board ceremonies for them. I remember that there was a Grand Master's Demolay Day that happened up in Utica one year, and I was asked by Most Worshipful Bill Sardone, who was the Grand Master of Demolay at that time, to help create a Demolay festive board that we did. So they had all the Demolay boys were actually sort of in the tables, and they were doing the ceremonies, and then there was all these kind of round tables around the outside
Oh,
that the
that's cool.
parents and the families and people like that sat at.
Yeah.
Um, our grandmaster kicked off the first sort of just omni festive board for the metropolitan area last year, I think I want to say it was. I created that ceremony for them. And I think that if you're a lodge who feels like that this might be a lot of work or it might be difficult or whatever it is, at least from the ceremonial standpoint, scale it down, do whatever
Mm.
it is that you want to do. Like there's no, a lot of people feel like, oh, well, a festive board has to have the 7 obligatory toasts and they have to be followed by a response and they have to,
Hmm.
says who?
Yeah.
As I say, we do a short form once a month in our lodge. And what that consists of is we do the opening, the same opening that we do for the beefsteak festive board. Everybody starts eating. At some point, there may be 1 or 2 toasts that are done. Those are done completely all'improviso. The the way that then the toast is given afterwards is sort of the same way, and it's one of these sort of weird things, right? Which was cool about the festive boards. And then there's a ceremonial closing, when we're getting ready to go home for the night. And so there's definitely been times when it's been 1 toast, and there's everything right about that, actually. It makes the evening special. It gives the brethren a reason to stick around, and it gives guests a reason to want to come to experience that.
I wanted to ask you about that. I like to refer to this as a Sam's book for those that are not familiar. The standard work and lecture of the Grand Lodge of New York, with its little
It's
class.
always embarrassing if I forget some of the stuff in there because I'm like, I did curate that entire book.
Well, you go looking through this, and there's no ritual, as you mentioned. There's nothing written down as far as a script for a festive board. A lot of brothers turn to the internet. I've heard of brothers say, "Oh, we got this from the Grand Lodge of Wisconsin or wherever else." What are some resources that you would recommend if guys were just looking for structure of how to put together this event, at least when it comes to the ritual side of it?
Well, so I think, look, I mean, first of all, they can contact me. Uh, but, I think that as I say, you can look around on the internet and you can find, and look, I guarantee you that if you find 2 or 3 of these things, eventually you're going to find one that is either just a direct copy of or highly derivative of the Independent Royal Arch Table Lodge. And then what I would suggest is to start pulling those things apart, figure out, divide that into sections and figure out this does this, this does this, this does this. How can we do this in a way that works for us?
Mm.
And I actually think that every lodge really should have some unique and distinctive dining customs that work for that lodge in a variety of contexts. And look, I don't necessarily think that it would work for very many lodges to do what we do and have like a short form festive board once a month. That is a lot of work.
Mm.
We have a lot of stewards. All of our, we have an extended degree cycle, so usually it takes a couple of years before you're a master mason. And guess what? The entered apprentices and fellow crafts get to do during the festive boards.
Mm.
And I do those things too. You never ask somebody to do something you wouldn't do yourself. When we first started doing those, my first year in the East, I also cooked all of the dinners. So,
Hmm.
but I think you just look around and you say to yourself, okay, so here's this thing that's done. How is a way for that to work for me? And I would also say, certainly if it's something that you're going to do on a regular basis, you can choose some other sorts of stuff, some kind of cool toast that's done, or some kind of something that you could even do in a restaurant. That's not wouldn't necessarily disturb a lot of the other people there, right? You're not going to sing songs or stand up and do toasts. But one of the things that I saw, which I thought was kind of a cool idea that I didn't end up appropriating was looking at some of the, I want to say it's either a Navy or a Marine tradition in there, what is called dining in, where there's this whole sort of ceremonial, like bringing a platter with the roast in, and bringing it to, the senior officer or whoever's emceeing the thing or whatever it is, who sort of tastes it a little bit, cuts off a piece and tastes it and says, okay, this is good. I declare it good, and so then they, there's been a few times at opening of the beefsteaks that we've done a ceremonial purging of the lodge of vegetarians and vegans. Which I will say was suggested by a member of the lodge who was a vegetarian. He's like, man, can I just show up to this thing and like have a couple of beers and then you can like hound me out of the room? I mean, we actually provide vegan and vegetarian meals for people that want them. But,
he didn't have the secret grip and word of a meat eater.
Like, he was like, no, cows are our friends. I said, back to the evil hell that spawned you. But I think that, there's what I would suggest is that anybody who wants to do a festive board or table lodge and find some stuff on the internet, to not do that. Someone's already doing that. And I also find that a lot of the, there's just been times where I've, sort of shown up to a festive board and some guy has stood up and spent sort of like 20 minutes giving some kind of boring explanation of, we call the fork the cutlass and the, and that stuff, by the way, was all eventually by somebody lifted out of these French exposures.
Thank you, whoever did all of that work, because.
But it's like nobody cares. It's not like people are saying, fill me up with some of that gunpowder. It's not happening. So, like, why even talk about it? To me, that makes, like, no sense at all. And I would think, look, especially if you're a small lodge and you're starting small, there's no reason that you couldn't have a great festive board or just a monthly dining tradition that you do that involves singing a lodge song or, a variety of other things. There's no reason that couldn't be done with 18 people in attendance.
Nice.
No reason whatsoever. And you may find, like I did, when we started doing these at Mariners Lodge, in that first year, we quintupled our attendance at lodge meetings.
Yeah, it's so definitely a draw. I mean, there's lodges that are great at ritual, they have great programs, or they have this, and that's like the fellowship / brotherhood aspect that's what gets guys to go, hey, this is better than Netflix. I'm going to go to lodge and be a part of this.
And it's a great place to bring prospects.
Absolutely.
Guys that might be interested in joining your lodge. We've started basically saying, look, we'd like you to come to about a year's worth of these things before we'll start talking about giving you a petition.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I sort of explain, look, we want to make sure that you're still going to be interested in Masonry and that you can afford it and that, you can meet on the nights that we meet. But, one of the other things that I say is, hey, listen, there's all this, moral improvement and intellectual development and spiritual growth and all these things you can get from Masonry. But if you don't want to have a built-in excuse to hang out with some guys that are your friends a couple, 3 times a month, eventually you're going to leave. And that, that there is a moment when you're made a Mason, when you open your eyes for the first time as a Mason. And you want to look out and see a bunch of guys that that are your friends, not me and a bunch of strangers. And, that is a great way to sort of get people interested and get them involved in kind of, what's going on with the lodge. And hey, it's great if you're doing a lot of that stuff on the same night that you meet. It's not that much more work.
So, Right Worshipful, some time has passed since we kicked off this conversation. I'm hoping that while we've been talking, somebody was like, hey, I got to hit pause, open up the podcast notes so I can get my browser open, go to NewYorkMasonicCon.com so I can get tickets to be a part of this. Or you're like me, you've already got yours. You've triple checked in your Apple wallet that the ticket is there and ready so that you can be a part of this monumentous event on Friday night, January 17th at the Grand Lodge of New York in New York City. Again, dinner time is at 6:30. For those of us that are going for the first time, I'm selfishly asking this question. I've taken notes. Don't eat every meat that comes to you. This is a marathon, not a race. I don't have to worry about eating with my hands, which is a good thing. What advice
we
do you
have forks and knives.
Yeah, that's a plus. What advice do you have for the first timer? What do you want them to kind of be prepared with before we show up?
Well, so one of the things that I'll say is if you want to drink something that's not beer, bring it. Because what we provide is, one of our members is one of the owners of the Bronx Beer Hall. So, it's draft beer, locally produced, different brands of beer. And that's what we offer. It's a meat and beer event. But bring whatever you want. If you want to bring a bottle of wines, people bring spirits and they'll sort of share them around. That's one of those things, you want to be careful that you don't have too much of that you fall asleep at your seat, which has happened a few times. And, what I would say is come hungry and well rested, right? Because, if we're opening the doors at, whatever, I'm not sure, let's say 6 o'clock or 5:30, and we're going to have the opening gavel at 6:30, you very well could be rolling out of there at 9:30, 10 p.m. And, it's definitely, and I would say, really for the best is if you can bring a bunch of guys like from your lodge or whatever, so you can kind of all be, sitting together. And it's really, it's not complicated. I think it's if you have the capacity and if you're around here and you have some gentlemen that who have a potential interest in Masonry, it's a great event to bring them to. Because the other thing that we wanted to evoke, you'll see sometimes these old pictures from, let's say, the 40s and the 50s of a First Manhattan District, dinner dance or something like that. And you look at this room and it's just, all of these guys in, tuxedos, and their wives are dressed to the nines, and, the tables are arranged in a certain way. And you're just like, man, that just looks so cool. It would just be great if we could have like a giant thing like that. And, look, if you go on YouTube and you do a search for Mariners Lodge Sea Shanty, you'll be able to see, circa 400 people, all in tuxedos and butcher's aprons, singing the song. And that'll give you a good idea of what it's going to look like and what the experience is going to be. And the other thing I will say, and this is not an advice on how to enjoy it. It's an admonition to people who do show up, is that for goodness sake, after the toast is done, there's a response. Sit down, stop talking so that we can get the guy to give the response. Because let me tell you, you don't want to be the guy that has to get pointed out who's talking over when the Grand Master is supposed to be giving his response. That's just a thing that I don't personally recommend that you do.
Come hungry, be well rested, and sit down and shut up after the toast.
and expect something that, one of the sort of foundational aspects of the Masonic culture of my lodge, which was chartered by the City Grand Lodge of New York, which was a schismatic Grand Lodge in the early 19th century, is that we wanted to give a flavor of that. And so we wanted to have, clinking glasses and boisterousness and loud conversation and all these sorts of things. I mean, not for nothing, right? William Preston and some of his buddies got in bad trouble at one point because they were walking back from a lodge meeting, several sheets to the wind, shall we say, and still in their Masonic aprons. So, I mean, having that kind of a good time is something that goes back really to, practically the beginning of speculative Masonry.
Awesome. I can't tell you how much I'm looking forward to this Friday night, January 17th, the Mariners Lodge number 67, Festive Board and beefsteak dinner. I am so proud to be able to say I get to attend this for the first time, and we'll be looking for you. Right, Worshipful Samuel Lloyd Kinsey, thank you so much for taking time and talking about this great event with us. And I look forward to seeing you when this episode airs next month in New York City.
Right on. I'll see you soon.